Around 1 a.m. on May 16, 2006, a 35-year-old woman named Allison Rivera bolted upright suddenly in her bed in her home in Baltimore, Maryland. Her home security alarm was blaring. But even though that was obviously pretty surprising, it didn't really surprise her, because the alarm had gone off at almost the exact same time the night before. And so now, in the dark, Allison could see the shape of her husband, Ray, as he grabbed a baseball bat, and then Ray rushed out of the room and down the stairs he went, and Allison quickly trailed right behind him. And when the two of them got downstairs near the alarm still going off, they flipped on the lights and they looked around, but Allison didn't see anybody inside of their house, and all the doors were shut. But when she looked at one specific window, she saw it was just slightly open. And again, this didn't totally surprise her, because the previous night when their alarm had gone off, they had gotten in touch with the police, and the police had looked around, and even though they didn't find anybody, they discovered that that particular window that was currently open slightly had been tampered with the night before, which set off the alarm, and it apparently had happened again tonight. But the police didn't think this was an attempted break-in. They said the alarm had probably been set off by a squirrel. Now, at the time, Allison and Ray had, thought that was pretty crazy that a squirrel had set off the alarm here, but it seemed plausible, and the police seemed pretty certain of it, and so they had accepted it and just gone back to bed after, turning off the alarm and shutting the window again. But now, 24 hours later, to be standing in their house, the alarm's going off, and clearly this window has been lifted up again, it just seemed weird that a squirrel's doing this? That just seems far-fetched. Something's off here. And so Allison and Ray, they couldn't help but feel like maybe the police were wrong. Maybe this is an attempted break-in by a person, not a squirrel. In fact, Allison had this nagging fear about what was maybe going on here that she couldn't shake. She wondered if someone might be out to get her husband, Ray. Ray and Allison had recently moved to Baltimore because Ray had gotten a job at this financial investment firm called Stansberry & Associates that was in the city. Ray's actual job was to write the firm's email newsletter, which gave advice to subscribers about buying and selling stocks. But Ray didn't actually know anything about investing. His background was in screenwriting and freelance videography, not finance. And the only reason he'd gotten the job was because one of his friends owned the company and had basically hired him as a favor. So even though Ray was sort of trying his best here, some of the advice that he was pumping out in this newsletter was terrible, and people had very likely lost money because of it. So it felt possible that maybe one of these disgruntled subscribers could have found Allison and Ray's address and was now trying to get even with Ray. But even though this seemed plausible, that theory was kind of wild and conspiratorial, and so on this night, Allison didn't say anything about these fears to Ray. Instead, she just went over and turned off the alarm while Ray did a sweep of the house and then also made sure this window was firmly shut. And then afterward, Allison asked Ray if maybe they should call the police again. But, Ray just said no. He said, very likely it was just a squirrel like the police said, and so the house is safe, we're okay, let's just go to bed. And so even though Allison felt pretty uneasy here, she said okay, and the two of them went back to bed. Early the next morning, Allison sat at the dining room table and quickly ate the breakfast that Ray had made for her. She was leaving that morning for a business trip 3 hours away in Virginia, and she needed to get on the road. So after finishing her food, she put her plate in the sink, and then Ray carried her suitcase out to her car for her, and then she and Ray exchanged I love yous, and then Allison got into the car and drove off, waving at Ray as she left. 3 hours later, Allison made it to Virginia. She would spend the entire day working, and then finally at about 6:30 p.m., she checked into the hotel where she was staying. By this point, Allison was so exhausted that she practically collapsed onto the hotel bed. All she wanted to do was just check in with Ray, watch a little TV, and go to sleep. So she took out her phone and she called him. It rang a few times, but just went to voicemail. So Allison waited and then tried again. But the same thing happened, which was odd. Allison wondered if Ray wasn't picking up because something had come up with work or maybe family. Normally he would answer, and certainly he'd be expecting a call from her around this time. But fortunately, one of Allison's colleagues, whose name was Claudia, was actually staying with them in Baltimore. She was traveling through the area, and so that night, she was going to be there with Ray. So Allison called Claudia, who did pick up, and she asked Claudia if Ray was around. And what Claudia said was pretty surprising. She said a couple hours earlier, so between 5 and 6 o'clock, Ray had been at the house. He'd been doing something on his computer down the hall from the guest room where Claudia was staying. And from the guest room, Claudia said she heard Ray's cell phone ring. He picked up the call, and a few seconds later, he said, quote, "Oh shit." Then Ray, literally, according to Claudia, sprinted out of the house. Claudia heard him climb into his car, and he peeled out of the neighborhood. Claudia said she had no idea where he'd gone, and he still was not back. Now, obviously, Allison was confused when she heard this, but she did not immediately panic. She figured that whatever had sent Ray running out of the house was probably just an emergency with work or friends or family, which, could be bad, but she assumed Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he got a chance. And so Allison thanked Claudia, doing her best not to give off any vibes that she was worried, and then she hung up and began getting ready for bed. And the whole time, Allison is watching her phone, waiting for what she is sure will be a call from Ray. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., Allison woke up to the sound of her phone finally ringing. She felt this immediate jolt of hope that it was Ray calling to explain what was going on, but when she looked at the face of her phone, she saw it was actually Claudia calling. But she figured, okay, maybe Claudia is with Ray and she has an update that everything's fine and that this is all gonna be explained. And so Allison picked up and she goes, "Hey, Claudia, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" And Claudia said, "Your husband has not come home yet. I have no idea what's going on with him, but I have to leave. I have to go to the airport." At this point, Allison couldn't even hide her worry in her voice. I mean, she basically was completely panic-stricken. What was going on with Ray? It was completely unlike him to stay out all night, miss her calls, and still not be home. Like, she had no idea what was going on here. So she told Claudia, who at this point is basically saying, "Do you want me to stay and wait for your husband?" She was sort of insinuating this. Allison told Claudia, "Go ahead, go to the airport, do your thing. I'm gonna cancel my work trip. I'm coming home. I gotta figure out what's going on with Ray." As soon as Allison was off the phone, she packed up her stuff, she checked out at the hotel, and began the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore. As she drove, she did her best to stay calm, but she's calling Ray's cell phone basically the whole time, over and over and over again, and he wasn't answering. And then eventually, when she would call, it wouldn't even ring. It would just go straight to voicemail, suggesting that his phone was turned off or maybe, had died. And at that point, Allison really couldn't control her panic. I mean, she knew something's wrong here. She had this theory that had something to do with her husband. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. It just felt like something bad has happened here, and she had no idea what it was. And so Allison spent the rest of the drive frantically calling Ray's workplace, his friends, his family, asking everybody if they had heard from him or if they had called him and said something that freaked him out the previous evening, anything. But everyone she spoke to said they had not seen or heard from Ray. When Allison finally pulled onto her street, she had this hope, this small hope that she would get home and Ray's car would be there and Ray would be inside and he'd have a story that would explain this whole crazy thing. But no, she got there, his car was gone, the house is empty, and she just knew something is definitely wrong. And so she turned right around and drove to the police station. However, when Allison reported her husband was missing to the police, it was immediately clear to her that the police were not really that concerned. Ray was an adult who had apparently left the house of his own volition. He also hadn't even been gone for a full 24 hours yet. So the police took down Allison's report and they did tell her they would look for him. But she just felt like they were not nearly as concerned as she was. But Allison and Ray's friends and family were definitely concerned. And over the next few days, they flocked to Baltimore to support Allison and also to help look for Ray. They drove all around the city, literally looking for Ray, but they didn't see any sign of him anywhere. They called local hospitals and asked about any John Does who maybe had come in, but none of them matched Ray's description. They also checked Ray's bank records, but he hadn't used any of his cards since he had disappeared. And as days passed with no new information and no new updates from police, Allison only got more and more desperate. And so finally, one afternoon, a couple of days after Ray first went missing, she just started looking through her own house, looking for any clues about where Ray had gone. And eventually, when she was in that room where Ray had been on his computer, when Claudia had heard him, swear into the phone and bolt out of the house, in that room at Ray's desk, she did find something strange. It was this piece of paper that was folded up really small, and it was wrapped in plastic, and it was taped to the back of his computer monitor. And so Allison peeled off the tape, she opened up the bag, and she unwrapped the paper. And what she found is it was a typed letter addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. And then the actual contents of this letter made absolutely no sense. It referenced some kind of secret society called the Council. It talked about secrets and some kind of game, and it also contained 3 lists. One with technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There was one with a bunch of movie titles that seemed to be completely random, and also there was one with names of real people, but they included celebrities and also some of Ray's family members. Now, to any random person, this note would have probably looked pretty unhinged, maybe even like a possible manifestation of serious mental illness. But to Allison, it actually didn't read that way. She knew Ray was very interested in conspiracies and secret societies from a creative standpoint. And so after a brief moment of confusion when she first read this thing, she decided, maybe this document was him collecting ideas for a new screenplay. It wouldn't have surprised her at all if he was trying to write a script about the Council, whatever that was. But what did surprise Allison was the way this letter was printed, folded up, and then taped to the computer. It just seems so weird. So Allison actually took the note to the police station and handed it over to the officer in charge of Ray's case. The officer took it as evidence and said they'd be in touch with her about it. But they weren't in touch, and more days went by and Ray didn't show up and there were no updates from police, and so Allison really didn't know what to do. But then on May 22nd, so 6 days after Ray disappeared, Allison was at home when she got her call from her parents. They said they'd been driving around the city looking for Ray, and they had found something. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Heaviness in your life doesn't usually announce itself. Typically, it just sort of hits you. For example, when I left the military and had to reintegrate back into civilian life, that meant I was leaving behind a clear mission, I was leaving behind tight-knit bonds and an identity that was built on service and purpose, while I was also trying to find my place in a world that felt very unfamiliar. And so this made me carry this really deep emotional weight that I was not expecting. Now, at the time, I kind of told myself that feeling, that heaviness inside of me, that it would just sort of pass with time. Once I get situated as a civilian, it'll just go away. But it didn't. And eventually, I began to wonder, why am I still struggling with this? Why do I still feel this really intense weight on me? Well, the reason for that is emotional weight does not just disappear because your life moves on. It stays with you unless you deal with it. That heaviness, it's not like a symbol of a failure in your life. In reality, it's just your brain holding on to what at one point was keeping you safe. Now, if you're feeling this way, having some awareness around this definitely helps. But untangling it, getting this weight sort of off your shoulders, often requires someone trained to help you let it go. The new year is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about finding support that helps you feel lighter moving forward. A great starting point for anybody who thinks they could use this type of service is BetterHelp. With over 30,000 licensed therapists, you'll have access to a diverse community of professionals across different specialties, backgrounds, and locations. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month and take a step toward feeling lighter in 2026. A few minutes later, Allison skidded into a parking lot in downtown Baltimore and parked her car right next to her parents' car. The area was swarming with police officers and news vans, and through this chaotic crowd, Allison could see what they were all looking at. It was Ray's car. And so Allison jumped out of her vehicle and she ran to the nearest police officer and she asked them what was going on. And they told her, after Allison's parents had called her about Ray's car, that was the thing they had found, they'd called the police and officers had come to investigate. And they discovered that Ray's car had a parking ticket on the windshield that showed it had been parked in this lot for 6 days. So since the evening of May 16th, which meant Ray's car had been right here since the night he'd gone missing, which was May 16th. The officer told her that none of Ray's belongings, like his phone or his money clip, were inside the vehicle, and there was no sign of a break-in, so they weren't stolen from the vehicle. So on the surface, it appeared that on the night Ray went missing, he'd driven here, parked in this lot, gotten out, but after that, nobody knows what happened. This discovery sent Allison's fear and panic to a whole new level. And it also seemed to make the police and the public take Ray's disappearance much more seriously. All of a sudden, people all over the city were looking for Ray. And 2 days later, on May 24th, so this is 8 days into Ray's disappearance, a volunteer search party decided to go onto the roof of a downtown parking garage to get a better view of the city to help with their search for Ray. And when they got up there, they saw something that, if it had to do with Ray, it was very dark. And so they called the police. Adjacent to this parking garage was a historic building called the Belvedere. It used to be a hotel, but now it was just a condo complex. The Belvedere, at its highest point, was 13 stories high. But it also had a smaller section that was still a part of the Belvedere that was just 2 stories high, and they kind of butted up against the 13-story section. From the top of the parking garage where the search party was, they could see the Belvedere, of course, but they could also look down and see the roof of the smaller section of the Belvedere. They could see the very top of that building. And on the roof, they saw 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a cell phone, and a very obvious hole in the roof. Within the hour, a detective named Michael Bayer and a team of Baltimore PD officers followed a concierge down the hallway of the Belvedere Hotel building. When Detective Bayer and his team had arrived, they'd asked the building staff about a hole in the roof of that 2-story section of the Belvedere, but none of them knew what the police were talking about. The employees said that that 2-story section of the hotel where the hole apparently was closed off and had been for a long time, so nobody, at least none of them, had gone over there, not anytime recently, and so they really couldn't speak to there being a hole or not. It was possible, but nobody knew. And on top of that, nobody, not staff or guests, had reported seeing or hearing anything strange in the last week and a half, so there was no indication that damage had been done really anywhere in the hotel. But now, the concierge led Detective Bayer and his team down several winding hallways and through a series of locked doors until eventually they reached the room that corresponded to where the hole in the roof was. And as soon as the concierge unlocked that door that would lead into that room, Detective Bayer and his team were hit by a horrible smell. They went inside to this big, large, empty room that looked like it once had been a conference room, and daylight was streaming down through the hole in the roof. And the light was shining directly on Ray Rivera's body. Ray was lying on the floor, face up, surrounded by dried blood, and his body was mangled. One of his legs had been broken so badly that the bones were sticking up at odd angles, and he was very badly decomposed, and so obviously was responsible for the smell. At first glance, Detective Bayer is looking at Ray's body, he's looking at the roof, and he's thinking, okay, clearly Ray, fell through the roof down here. That's how he's got here. He came through the roof. But when police examined the hole, and also those items that the search party had literally seen from their vantage point on the roof, the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then also when they did an autopsy on Ray's body, they realized that it actually was physically impossible for Ray to have come through the hole into this room, because there were only 3 possible places that Ray could have fallen or jumped from to land on the Belvedere's roof where the hole was. And none of them made sense when compared to the evidence that police had. The first possibility was that Ray had fallen or jumped from the very top of the Belvedere, which is 13 stories tall. A fall from that height would definitely have killed him and caused the devastating injuries found in the autopsy, like broken legs, a broken skull, broken ribs. But the edge of the 13th story roof was 45 feet away horizontally from the hole in the 2nd story roof. And so from a physics perspective, it was basically impossible that Ray could have somehow gone fast enough and then leapt off the roof as fast and as far as he could, that he could have carried himself 45 feet forward before plummeting down and hitting the roof. That's just too far of a distance for a person to jump. The second possibility was that Ray maybe had gone off of a thin decorative ledge that wrapped around the outside of the Belvedere on the 11th floor. If Ray fell from there, he could have landed in the spot where the hole was. However, that ledge was impossible to access without first going through a privately owned condo or office. Ray would have had to be physically let in, But again, nobody in any part of the building had reported seeing or interacting with him. And the third possibility was that Ray had gone off the top of that same parking garage that the search party had been at. It was close enough horizontally that, Ray could have landed in the spot where the hole was. But the very top of that parking garage was only about 20 feet above the second-story roof of the Belvedere, which was obviously enough of a height to fall to have serious damage done to your body, but that's not enough of a fall to cause the extreme injuries that were found on Ray's body. It just wasn't enough. And then to make this whole situation even stranger, when police examined those items that were found on the roof, Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and cell phone, they found that all the items were not, helter-skelter, sort of cast around as if he blasted through the roof and everything fell off of him. No, they were sort of organized, placed neatly on the roof like they had been staged on purpose. And also, Ray's glasses and phone were not damaged at all. So it just sort of begged the question, how could this have happened? How did he fall in the first place? How did he wind up in this room? But even if you identify where he fell from or how he fell, how did his belongings wind up placed so neatly on the roof like that without any damage? It just didn't add up. And so the police didn't know what to make of any of this. And so they turned their attention back to a totally different piece of evidence. That weird note that Allison had found taped to the back of Ray's computer in their home. And so they sent that note to the FBI for analysis, hoping it would tell them something. And it did. The FBI said that based on the note, Ray was likely mentally ill and experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. This was not like a screenplay, this was, manifestation of something off in his mind. And the police, this didn't really answer all their questions, but it was sort of a relief. It seemed like, this sort of generally answers a very complicated and confusing situation. Basically, this was enough for the Baltimore PD to stop investigating, although they didn't actually officially close the case, and tell Ray's wife, Allison, and her family that Ray's death, as bizarre as it is, even though we don't really know how it happened, what we do know is that it most likely was a suicide. But Allison was not satisfied with this explanation. Because one, it still didn't answer the question of where Ray had fallen from. That seemed like an important thing to answer. And two, she didn't think Ray was mentally ill, and she was certain he had not killed himself. Allison's theory was that her husband was murdered, very likely because of his job. Here he is parading around like he's got great investment advice and he's pumping out his tips into that newsletter that she knows and he knows are basically fraudulent. He doesn't know anything about investing. The opportunity to basically screw over subscribers was pretty high. People are taking his advice and they could be losing money because of it. And so it seemed entirely possible that somebody who was disgruntled over his bad advice came after him. And then also adding to the idea that this was not, self-harm, that something bad happened to Ray from an outside source. There was that strange phone call that Claudia, the friend, overheard him have when he said, "Oh shit," and then ran out the house. The police were able to trace that particular call back to Stansberry and Associates, the investment firm where Ray worked, but they were never able to figure out who had placed it or why. Because as soon as detectives began asking questions of this firm, Stansberry and Associates hired attorneys and told its employees not to speak about what happened to anyone, not even the police. And so to this day, Ray's case remains officially unsolved. But somewhere out there is the person who placed that final phone call to Ray. This person must know why Ray ran out of his house in a panic that night, and they might even know how he died or who killed him. But as of now, that person has not come forward. On the morning of March 22, 1977, a 44-year-old woman named Ruth Morgan rushed around her kitchen in the American city of Tucson, Arizona, like she did almost every day. Ruth was making sure her 4 daughters had everything they needed for school. As she did this, her girls all sat at the kitchen table eating their cereal, and their father, Ruth's husband, 39-year-old Chuck Morgan, sipped his coffee nearby. Ruth wished that Chuck would notice that she could really use some help right now getting the girls' stuff ready, but like he had been more and more recently, Chuck just seemed to be off in his own world. Annoyed, Ruth opened the fridge, took out 2 lunches packed in paper bags, and handed them to her younger daughters, and then she grabbed 2 backpacks that were lying on the floor nearby, and she handed them to her older girls. Then, a few minutes later, all 4 girls were hurrying out the door toward the car, with Ruth and Chuck following after them. As Chuck climbed into the driver's seat of their Mercury Cougar, Ruth, who was standing outside the car and would not be joining them, asked Chuck what time he'd be home from work. Chuck was going to drop the kids off and then go to his office. And for a second, Chuck didn't answer his wife. He just sat there looking totally exhausted. Chuck ran his own escrow company, which meant that his firm set up real estate deals between buyers and sellers to make sure the deals were conducted legally. And Tucson's real estate market was booming, so Chuck had been working a lot recently. Through the open car window, he turned and told Ruth that he was working on a huge deal, so he didn't really know what time he'd be back. Ruth wished Chuck did not have to work so much, but she also knew that nothing she said could stop him. As long as she'd known him, Chuck had been incredibly driven, to the point where sometimes Ruth worried about his health. He never took time off, and on the rare instances where he was not working, he didn't do things to relax, like watching TV or going and seeing his friends. Instead, it just seemed like Chuck bounced from one business deal or crisis to the next. And about once a year, he would push himself so hard with his work that he would basically have a nervous breakdown. At least that's what Ruth called it. And at that point, he would take a week off to recover, but that was it. The rest of the time, he basically worked 24/7. But Ruth also knew that Chuck's insane work ethic and drive was definitely paying off. It had already made their family much more financially successful than they ever imagined possible. Chuck and Ruth had grown up in very modest households, and so now to be able to give their girls a comfortable upbringing was quite satisfying for the parents. And so, on this typical Tuesday morning, Ruth did not push back on the possibility of Chuck needing to work late to finish this big deal. Instead, she just told him he looked great in his brown suit, she gave him a kiss, and watched as he turned on the car, pulled out of the driveway, and headed off in the direction of the girls' school. That afternoon, the girls came home from school on their own power, and Ruth sent them outside to play while she got dinner ready. She set a place at the table for the whole family, including Chuck, but when 6 o'clock rolled around and Chuck was still not home, Ruth and the girls decided to just eat without him. And when Ruth got the girls bathed and into their pajamas and tucked them into their beds, Chuck was still not home. But Ruth was not worried. This really was kind of typical for Chuck. Chuck's real estate clients were mostly rich businessmen who were buying up land all across the state, and they wanted a lot for their money. They were always calling Chuck away for meetings out of town without any warning, and sometimes Chuck would be gone at these meetings for a couple of days at a time without any notice. And at the time, in 1977, there were no cell phones, and most people, including Ruth and her family, didn't have answering machines. And so, when Ruth hadn't seen Chuck or heard from him, she just figured he must have tried calling the house earlier to let her know that he would indeed be out super late on this deal, but she just must have missed the call because she was out running errands, and so Chuck would just get back whenever he got back. So that night, Ruth went to bed alone, figuring that she would wake up and see Chuck in the morning, or at a minimum, she would get a call the next day from Chuck to figure out where he was, what he was doing, and when to expect him home. But the next day, Chuck did not come home, and he didn't call. And it was the same story the next day. But again, Ruth had seen this behavior from Chuck before. It was rare, but Chuck did sometimes just kind of vanish for days at a stretch on certain deals. And so, at 2 a.m. on March 25th, 3 days after Ruth last saw Chuck or heard from Chuck, it was when he drove off to drop the girls at school, Ruth lay awake in her and Chuck's upstairs bedroom, trying to now convince herself that Chuck was fine, that everything was okay, that this was totally normal. But she now knew that this was officially the longest stretch of time she had ever gone without hearing from Chuck. And deep down, she started to feel like something had to be wrong. But as she lay there stressing out about all sorts of what-if scenarios, she heard the family dog barking downstairs, and instantly, Ruth let out a sigh of relief. The dog must be barking because Chuck was walking in the door. He was home. So Ruth climbed out of bed, she walked into the hallway, flipped on the light, and began heading downstairs. and as she descended the steps, she called out to Chuck, but no one answered. When she got to the first floor, there was still no answer, and the dog was now starting to bark even louder. And suddenly the hairs on Ruth's arms stood up. If Chuck wasn't home, why was the dog barking? What was going on? She dashed across the living room into the kitchen, she turned on the light, and saw the family dog up on its hind legs, pawing at the back door and barking. Ruth very slowly crept toward that door and pulled back the curtain that covered a small window on it, and she looked outside. And what she saw took her breath away. It was Chuck. However, he was just standing there on the back step, not making any attempt to come in the house. And he had this crazed look on his face, and when he saw Ruth, he didn't react. He just stood there staring. Ruth had no idea what her husband was doing. She was just relieved that he was home. And so she reached down and fumbled with the lock, she opened the door, and frantically told Chuck to come in and tell her what was going on, where had he been. But once the door was open, Chuck kind of just staggered into the kitchen and literally fell into Ruth's arms. She dragged him across the room and put him in one of the kitchen chairs, and then once he was seated, Ruth finally got a good look at her husband and she nearly screamed. Chuck's eyes were totally bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and his wrists were bound with zip ties, and he had a plastic handcuff on one of his ankles. But what scared Ruth most of all was that Chuck still was just not speaking. She asked him again to tell her what was going on, but he just sat there silent, looking off into the distance. Ruth ran to a kitchen drawer and grabbed a knife, and then she rushed to Chuck and cut the ties around his wrists, and when Chuck's hands were free, he finally began to communicate with Ruth, but not with words, instead with hand gestures. He motioned towards a notepad and pen sitting on the counter nearby, and so Ruth, understanding what he was asking for, reached over and grabbed the pen and paper and handed them to Chuck. And as he wrote, Ruth, who was now kind of hovering over his shoulder, couldn't believe the words on the paper. When Chuck was done, Ruth ran to the phone and said they had to call 911 right now. But at this, Chuck banged on the table and shook his head at her to stop. Then, in huge letters on the pad, he told Ruth that if they called the cops, their whole family would be killed. Ruth moved away from the phone and started crying. Chuck began to stand up, and Ruth instinctively grabbed him and supported him on her shoulder, and then just walked him upstairs to their bedroom, where he lay down and fell asleep almost instantly. And after he was asleep, Ruth, not knowing what else to do, just did a quick check of the girls and was very relieved to see that none of them had woken up to the commotion of their father returning. Then Ruth headed back to her own bedroom and laid down next to Chuck, but she didn't shut her eyes. Instead, she lay awake trying to figure out what the heck just happened and what she was going to do about it. On the notepad, Chuck had written that he'd been kidnapped and tortured for 2 days before managing to escape, and that now his throat was coated with a hallucinogenic drug that made it impossible for him to talk and could maybe even kill him if he ingested it. It should be noted here that we don't really know if he meant the drug was painted inside of his throat or if it was painted on the outside of his neck. We just don't know. The whole thing just seemed totally insane, and so Ruth, as she lay there, started to wonder if maybe this was one of Chuck's annual nervous breakdowns from overworking. But if it was, then this was the most bizarre and extreme breakdown she had ever seen. It took almost a week for Chuck to recover from whatever had happened to him, and during that time, he only communicated with Ruth via notes on a notepad. Again, he was convinced there was a drug painted either on or in his throat that he had to avoid ingesting, and so not talking was his solution. At the beginning of this recovery week, Ruth asked Chuck lots of questions about where he had been and what had happened, but again, she got virtually no answers from him. And so pretty early on in that week, Ruth just began focusing on nursing her husband back to health, which included giving him water through an eyedropper because he had written that if he drank too much liquid at one time, this hallucinogenic drug coating his throat might activate and attack his nervous system. Finally, after that week of recovery was up and Chuck got out of bed and started talking again, Ruth now demanded answers about this whole crazy situation. But nothing Chuck said to her made any sense. Chuck told Ruth that owning his escrow business was not his only job. In addition to his escrow business, he was actually an undercover agent for the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department is a federal agency that investigates financial crimes. Chuck didn't say who had kidnapped him, but he said they knew he had information that could send them to prison for a long time. As Ruth listened to what her husband was saying, she simply didn't believe him. Instead, she thought this really had to be one of his big annual nervous breakdowns, and that eventually he would just snap out of this and be normal Chuck again. And so, when Chuck insisted that Ruth not tell anyone what he had told her about his real identity and the trouble he had now gotten into, Ruth didn't really care and said, "Fine, I won't tell anyone." But over the next couple of months, Chuck did not snap out of it. He did not become normal Chuck. Instead, his mental state seemed to get worse and worse. He started wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a .357 Magnum revolver, which is a very powerful pistol, whenever he left the house. He also bought a special belt that could conceal a knife in the buckle, and he grew a big thick beard to disguise his face. He was also convinced that someone had bugged their home phone, so he started to leave the house and go to payphones whenever he had to make calls. And whenever Ruth, who was now becoming very seriously concerned for her husband, asked him what was going on or what he was so scared of, he would just tell her the less she knew, the safer she'd be. On the morning of June 7th, so about 2.5 months after Chuck had stumbled in their back door insisting he had been kidnapped and drugged, Ruth wound up driving the girls to school that morning. When she left, Chuck told her he would be going to his office that day. After Ruth left, Chuck headed to a payphone near their house and called his staff, informing them that he would be there in about a half an hour. But he never showed up, and eventually someone from his staff called the police. Even though Ruth had done what her husband had asked and had not gone to police or told anyone about his strange behavior, she couldn't help but feel incredibly relieved when she heard that the Tucson police had put out a missing person alert for Chuck. However, when the police spoke to her, she opted to continue keeping Chuck's secret, mostly because she was worried if she told them what he told her, they would think he was crazy or dangerous. And so all she told police was that she was just very worried about him and hoped he would come home soon. 9 days later, on the night of June 16th, Chuck had still not been found, he was still missing, no one knew where he was, and this night, Ruth was home, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, but she wasn't really watching it. Her mind was wondering where the heck her husband was, and she couldn't help but think that something terrible had happened to him. And as she sat there staring blankly at the TV, the phone rang in the kitchen. And suddenly, Ruth felt a jolt of energy, thinking maybe it was Chuck. And so she ran to the kitchen, she answered the phone, but instead of hearing her husband's voice, she heard a woman's voice that she didn't recognize, and in a quiet voice, the strange woman said, "Ruthie, Chuck is all right. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Then the woman hung up. Ruth just stood there for a second, holding the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Now she was even more confused. Was this some sign that Chuck really was an undercover agent for the Treasury Department, and this woman maybe worked with him there, and maybe she was like his handler, and maybe she was now reaching out to Ruth with some code? I mean, Ruth had no idea, but at least now, Ruth had a clue about what happened to her husband. She had this Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. So Ruth hung up the phone and ran to a bookshelf in the living room. She stretched up to reach the top shelf and she grabbed her family Bible, and then Ruth rushed with the Bible to the couch. She sat down and flipped through the pages until she got to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verses 1-8. Ruth read the verses, but she didn't understand what they could possibly have to do with Chuck. They read in part, quote, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken." End quote. Ruth eventually just slammed the Bible closed because she had no idea what it meant, and frankly, she had no idea what to think about anything anymore. and at this point, all she hoped for was that her husband was somehow still alive somewhere in the world and that hopefully he would return soon. About 24 hours later, on June 17th, Chuck, who was actually only a few miles away from his home, sped through Tucson in his Mercury Cougar, constantly checking his rearview mirror to make sure no one was following him. Then he suddenly turned into the parking lot of a cheap motel where he had been hiding out for the last few days, and he came to a stop. Chuck was wearing his bulletproof vest over a sweat-stained dress shirt, and he was also now missing a tooth. Chuck grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, and he unholstered his .357 Magnum. Then he climbed out of his car, slammed the door, and sprinted with the briefcase and gun in hand toward the motel. Once safely inside his room, Chuck locked the door and placed the gun as well as the briefcase down on the bed. And then he opened the briefcase, and what he saw made him smile. He was looking at $60,000 in cash stacked neatly inside. For reference, $60,000 then would be worth about $300,000 in today's dollars. Chuck had put this money in the briefcase himself, but he was paranoid that somehow it would just disappear, and so looking at it calmed him down. Then Chuck closed the briefcase and pulled a black marker along with a $2 bill out of his pocket. $2 bills are the rarest form of cash produced in the United States. Then he placed that $2 bill on the bedside table and started writing on it with the marker. After he was done, he pulled his pants down and pinned the now marked up $2 bill to his underwear. Then he pulled his pants back up, he grabbed his gun, he grabbed the briefcase, and then he turned around and rushed right back outside to his car. Once he got there, he threw the briefcase into the passenger seat and then jumped into the driver's seat where he turned the ignition and peeled out of the parking lot. He sped west for a while and eventually pulled onto a dark desert road. After getting about 30 miles outside of Tucson, he swerved off the road into a secluded desert clearing where he stopped the car and cut the ignition. At this point, Chuck reached into his pocket and took out a wadded-up tissue, and he unwrapped it. Inside was the tooth he was missing. He stared at it for a second before balling it back up and then placing it in the back seat of his car. Then he checked to make sure his gun was still in his holster, and it was, and then after taking a deep breath, he grabbed the briefcase from the passenger seat and stepped outside of his car into the desert. The next day, June 18th, Ruth was in her living room when there was a knock at the front door. When Ruth opened it, an officer from the Pima County Sheriff's Department was standing there. For a second, Ruth felt a flood of relief. Maybe they were here to say they found Chuck and that he was okay. But moments later, when she was sitting on her couch in the living room, the officer told her that he had some bad news. Two people driving down a highway in the desert to the west of the city had just discovered Chuck's body. The officer told Ruth that Chuck was lying out in the sand and appeared to have committed suicide. The officer suggested that perhaps Chuck had had some sort of mental breakdown, as his appearance was totally bizarre. He was missing a tooth that looked like it had recently been knocked out or pulled out. He was armed with this powerful firearm, and in his pocket was a $2 bill with incomprehensible messages written all over it. Ruth was absolutely devastated, even though she wasn't really shocked at the news. After a moment, when she had composed herself, she asked the officer if any of the messages on the $2 bill might be like a suicide note for her and the kids, explaining what had happened. And the officer just shook his head and said, no, there was no communication left behind besides on this $2 bill, and that was definitely not intended for you. After hearing this, Ruth finally just broke down and sobbed. She felt a horrible sense of guilt and regret about how she had handled Chuck's behavior over the last few months. She wished she had just totally ignored his request and gone to the police right away, or at least told someone about what was going on with him, because maybe then he'd be alive. But underneath her own feelings of guilt, Ruth also started to feel kind of angry with Chuck. Why hadn't he left behind some sort of note for her or the kids? Why would he take his life without at least explaining the situation to his own family who he loved? It made no sense. In the aftermath of Chuck's death, Ruth planned his funeral and focused all of her energy on making sure her girls were okay. She didn't want to believe that Chuck had killed himself, but the police department was adamant that that was what happened. And in time, Ruth and her kids began to accept that that was the reality. Fast forward to sometime in the late 1980s, roughly a decade after Chuck had died, and Ruth was home in the same house she had shared with Chuck when her phone rang. And when she heard what the man on the other end of the line had to say, her heart suddenly started to beat rapidly and she had to grab a chair to sit down. The caller's name was Don Devereaux, and he was an investigative reporter, and he told Ruth that he wanted to meet with her because he had something very important to tell her. Something he said she might not believe. It was about her late husband, Chuck. When the pair met at a local coffee shop, Dawn asked Ruth if she was really ready to hear everything, even if it was painful. And Ruth, even though her voice trembled, didn't hesitate. She said, "Yes, tell me." Based on Dawn's independent investigation following Chuck's death, this is a reconstruction of what Dawn believes could have happened on the night of June 17, 1977, the night that police said Chuck committed suicide. According to Dawn's theory, on the night of June 17th, Chuck drove out into the desert, he parked, he stepped out of his car carrying that briefcase that contained $60,000 in cash, he had his .357 Magnum pistol on his hip, and more guns in the car, and as he's standing out there, he sees up ahead headlights suddenly appear a few yards away from where Chuck was standing, and once that car came to a stop, a man stepped out who was wearing a dark suit. Chuck took a step towards this man, but the man quickly pulled out a gun and aimed it at Chuck, and so Chuck froze. The man told him to show him the cash, at which point Chuck did open up the briefcase. The man told Chuck to put the briefcase on the ground and turn around, and so Chuck followed the instructions, believing that in just a few minutes, the nightmare he had been living through would finally be over, and he would be able to drive back home to Ruth and his girls, and then they could move far away and put all of this behind them forever. After turning away from the man in the suit, Chuck stood there listening to the sound of this man walking closer and closer to him. And then this man's footsteps stopped right behind him, and suddenly Chuck would have felt a jerk by his hip, and he would have realized the man in the suit had grabbed Chuck's gun from its holster. And then before Chuck could do anything, this man had fired Chuck's gun into the back of Chuck's head, killing him instantly. Then the man in the suit wiped the gun of his fingerprints and positioned it near Chuck's hand to make it look like Chuck had shot himself. Then the man in the suit grabbed the briefcase, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Chuck's body where he fell. Dawn wasn't sure if Chuck actually worked undercover for the U.S. Treasury Department, but Dawn did think that Chuck had somehow gotten involved with organized crime, most likely through his escrow business. Dawn believed that Chuck had been conducting illegal real estate deals that allowed criminals to smuggle drugs into Arizona from Mexico, and then Chuck was then laundering their drug money for them. Money laundering is concealing money gained illegally by transferring it through international banks into legitimate businesses like real estate. Dawn knew that weeks before Chuck's supposed kidnapping, the state of Arizona and the Arizona Attorney General's office had named Chuck as a witness in a trial that involved an organized crime boss. Dawn believed that that crime boss had hired a hitman to kill Chuck to keep him from testifying against him. And most likely, according to Dawn, Chuck had figured this out. And so that was why Chuck had begun carrying a weapon around and wearing a bulletproof vest all the time. But Dawn said he had learned from a friend of Chuck's, a woman known simply as, quote, Green Eyes, that the hitman had told Chuck he would call off the hit if Chuck just paid him, the hitman, $60,000 in cash. So Dawn believes that Chuck jumped at this opportunity to save himself, and it was likely the reason he left his house on June 7th, 1977, to go get the money and pay off the hitman. However, the meeting with the hitman didn't happen until June 17th, 10 days later. And obviously the hitman did not keep his promise. The hitman was very likely the man in the suit, and he just took the money from Chuck and killed him anyways. And so as for what Chuck was doing and why he was avoiding his wife and kids and the police during those 10 days between when he left his house on June 7th and disappeared and when he was killed on June 17th, Dawn, and everybody else for that matter, has no idea. And that was far from the only unanswered question in this case. The friend of Chuck's, known as Green Eyes, admitted to being the woman who called Ruth on June 16th, the night before Chuck died, to mention that Bible verse from Ecclesiastes. However, she never specified what it meant. Dawn believed that the Bible verse could be a code that Chuck had asked Green Eyes to pass along to Ruth and his family, maybe to signify that he was okay. But if the Bible verse was really a code, why hadn't Chuck given Ruth a way to crack it? Because she had no idea what it meant. Again, Dawn doesn't know, and really no one knows why. As for the tooth that was found in the back seat of Chuck's car out in the desert, Dawn said that had a very specific meaning. At the time Chuck died, there were rumors that some mobsters removed their victims' teeth to keep them from being identified by police after they were killed. So Dawn believed that maybe Chuck removed one of his teeth in advance of his meeting with this hitman and then left the tooth in his car to ensure officials would be able to still identify him if the worst were to happen during this meeting. As for the $2 bill that was found with the strange messages written all over it, Dawn said these messages were not nonsense at all. They were Chuck's attempt to tell the world what had happened to him. Dawn had not completely solved the riddle, but he believed he was close. On the front of the $2 bill, Chuck had written 7 Spanish last names. On the back, where the $2 bill shows a picture of the founding fathers who had signed the Declaration of Independence, Chuck had labeled each of the men in the picture with the numbers 1 through 7. He had also scrawled a crude map of a route from Tucson to the Mexican border. Dawn told Ruth that he believed the names and the map were Chuck's way of pointing to specific smugglers moving drugs between Mexico and Tucson. There was one last clue on the $2 bill. It was the phrase Ecclesiastes 12. This was the same section of the Bible that Green Eyes had mentioned to Ruth on the phone on June 16th. And so it supported the theory that the Bible verse could be some kind of code, but of course that code is still not cracked. After Dawn finished telling Ruth his theory about Chuck, Ruth felt a sense of relief that maybe finally she had gotten the explanation she had so desperately wanted for all these years. But at the same time, it was clear that Dawn's theory was just that, a theory. And there are many more compelling theories about Chuck, some that include him actually being an undercover agent for the government, others that paint him as a man who simply lost his mind. But as of today, all we know for sure is that Chuck was found shot to death out in the desert, and officially, his death is still listed as a suicide.